To all my Chaverim and Yedidim who listen to these Divrei Torah, I would first like to mention that for the time being, all these Divrei Torah will be coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. As many of you by now already know, I have accepted the appointment as becoming the Rav of the Mizrahi community here in Melbourne, and please God, Bez Hashem Yisbarach, I'll be able to continue with this community going, Mechayel El Choyel, from strength to strength. I'd like to thank all of you for all your wonderful good wishes on this move of ours, and also especially to thank the Melbourne community for their extremely warm welcome and for the opportunity to work together to build this community, Lahagdil Torah Ulahadia. Vayakhel-Pekudai Mishkan ha'edus asher pukad al pi Moshe. With Parshas Pekudai, we come to the end of the book of Shemos, and we come to the end of 5 Parshas, Truma Tetzaveh, Kisisa, Vayakhel-Pekudai, all dealing with in extreme detail, again and again and again, everything that went, all the work that went into the building of the Mishkan, and we've spoken about some of it already in the past. I'd like to have a look really at 3 interesting issues which are picked up here by Chazal in Parshas Pekudai, all of which I think has got some very interesting and extremely relevant contemporary applications and meaning for us. The first one is, Vayakhel-Pekudai HaMishkan, Moshe Rabbeinu is giving an account of all the gold and silver, precious jewels, the jewelry, and everything that was given to him, all the raw materials, all the 13 types of raw materials, kesef, zav, kesef, and nechoshes, tchelis, v'agoma, and talas shani, all of the different things, and he's giving an account of them as he's summing up the Malacha. And the Midrash Tanchuma asks the question, Lama osa cheshben? Why does Moshe Rabbeinu need to give an account? Is Moshe Rabbeinu not the epitome, on the highest order imaginable, of somebody who is totally trustworthy and totally believed? Didn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself say about Moshe Rabbeinu, B'chol beisi ne'emonu, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu trusted Moshe Rabbeinu totally in every dimension possible? Is it not true that it's one of the Yesodei Hadat, the principles on which the whole of Judaism is based, that our total trust and confidence in Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was the perfect transmitter of the Devar Hashem without adding and subtracting anything of his own, and that he was only able to do this with his total, complete anova, his modesty and his humility, and his ability to put his ego and his self-interest completely, not just on hold, but completely disappear in order to be able to be totally an Eved Hashem. Yismach Moshe b'matnas chelko, ki Eved ne'emon karosolo. So here we have somebody about whom there can't possibly be any doubts of his trustworthiness. Why does he feel the need to give us an account of every penny that went into the Mishkan? So Chazal say that actually Moshe Rabbeinu was doing what he's always doing, and that is he's teaching Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to teach that actually, irrespective of how trustworthy and how wonderful any treasurer of any communal funds is, and indeed we always choose the Gizbar of the Beis HaMikdash, the Gizbar of the Gaboy Tzedakah, the Gizbar, the treasurers of all different types of charitable collections. The Gizbar has to be somebody completely above and beyond any remote suspicion of any sort. Nevertheless, Moshe Rabbeinu says, everybody is accountable. Everybody has to feel that they need to show clearly that they are completely acting in good faith, above board, and they have completely used all the funds available to them in the best way possible. And this is a limud, and this is one of the principles of Jewish life throughout the ages, that the Gaboy Tzedakah and the Gizbarim have to be accountable, and this is learnt out from this week's Parsha. It actually has an interesting application also in the Mishnah, Maseches Shkolim, chapter 3, which speaks about the annual collection of the Shkolim. So, of course, everybody comes and gives their shekel in order to participate in the Korban Tzibur of the Beis HaMikdash and contribute their annual subscription, so to speak. So they were left with mountains of coins, of silver coins, of shekel. And there was a Gizbar who was in charge of it. And the Mishnah says that when the Gizbar went into the storehouse of silver coins in order to take out some coins to spend them on whatever was necessary for the upkeep and maintenance of the Beis HaMikdash and the Karbanos, etc., he went in with a certain type of clothing which had no pockets and had no turn-ups, and there was no way he could possibly conceivably hide even one coin. And he wore no shoes, and he couldn't even put a coin inside his shoes. And this was in order, says the Mishnah, because of the pasuk U'motzochein v'seichel toiv ba'einei Elokim v'odom. It's not completely good enough to act only totally according to ba'einei Elokim, to follow completely the halacha and the requirements of the Torah, but it has to be ba'einei Elokim v'odom. It has to also be in the eyes of other human beings behavior which is completely above board and not open to any misinterpretations of any sort. And this was, the Gemara actually spells it out in a very interesting way. It says, because of the leitzonei hadar, every generation has got leitzonim, has people who are comedians, literally a leitzana, clowns and comedians, people who will make fun of everything, including things which are actually not funny, actually things which are sacred, and one shouldn't turn into objects of humor. But the Leitzonim don't have any boundaries, and therefore, if the Gizbar would go in dressed with a coat that had pockets or shoes, then if it turned out later on in the year that the Gizbar became a wealthy man in some way, the Leitzonim would say, oh, of course he's a wealthy man. We know why he's wealthy. He's wealthy because he pocketed lots of those coins. If he became poor, the Leitzonim also would say, oh, we know why he became poor, because he pocketed all these coins, and this is a punishment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu for him to do it. In other words, people who wish to misinterpret a person's behavior in a malevolent way will always find a way to do so. And therefore, wherever possible, a person needs to be whiter than white. And this is especially true in matters where there is finances available and one needs to be accountable. And this is a principle in the Torah, in Halacha, which we learn out from Parshas Pekudai. And this is the first point that I'd like to mention from this parsha. The second point is brought out by the Sforno. The Sforno says, look at this, the whole of Klal Yisrael, Kol Nadiv Leiv, all the generous people gave gold and silver and nechoshes and tchedes v'agama, all sorts of precious items, and they were all brought together and used as raw materials. And what was made the Mishkan. But he says, have a look at this Mishkan, look at it carefully, and you will see something striking about this Mishkan. This accounting of the Mishkan is not in order to tell you how magnificent and massive it was, quite the contrary. The Mishkan was, in fact, he says, very small. Think about the Aron HaKodesh. The Aron HaKodesh at the heart of the Mishkan is 2.5 amos long. What is 2.5 amos? It's 1.5 meters. It's smaller than your breakfast table, right? And it was 1.5 meters wide. That's just over 1 meter, 1.20 meters. Even with the Chazon Ish's measurements of the Amma, we're talking about an extremely small item. 1.5 amos wide, 1.5 amos high, and 2.5 amos long. Very small. 1 meter by less than 1 meter, by less than 1 meter, by less than 1.5 meters. That was the whole Aron HaKodesh. Similarly, the Shulchan and the Mizbeach HaZahav, these were in fact very, very small items. Right? So therefore, says the Sforno, the Torah is coming to tell us you shouldn't think that the Mishkan was something massive and overwhelmingly impressive. And what's the idea behind this? And this is a very profound idea, profound philosophically and profound in terms of human behavior. He says, compare the Mishkan, for example, to the Beis HaMikdash of Shlomo HaMelech, and then compare that to the second temple, which was ultimately made into a fabulous building by Herod. What do you find? He says that as you proceed from the Mishkan to the Bais Rishon to the Bais Sheni, you proceed from a small, mobile sanctuary to something bigger and much more magnificent in the hands of Shlomo HaMelech, and something absolutely incredibly beautiful in the hands of Herod. But as it goes up in beauty and magnificence and in quantity, it diminishes in spiritual content. In other words, there is an inverse relationship between the magnificence of the chitzonius, of the outer beauty, against the genuine, authentic spiritual content. This was the Mishkan Asher Pukad Al Yedei Moshe. This had within it the Kedusha of Moshe Rabbeinu. And because it had the Kedusha of Moshe Rabbeinu, says the Gemara in Sota Taftes, therefore he says, Maisa Moshe Lo Butlu, that whatever Moshe made was never destroyed, was never captured by enemies. It remained La'olam Voed. Atzei Shittim Oimdim, say Chazal, Oimdim Lo Netzach, that the Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan, was never captured by enemies, it was never burnt, it was never destroyed. Shlomo HaMelech, in true, built a Beis HaMikdash and therefore superseded the Mishkan 480 years later, and he took all the artifacts made by Moshe Rabbeinu and he hid them away somewhere deeply buried inside the hills of Yerushalayim. That's where they are still Ad Hayom Hazeh. So he says there's some, that's why, because each one of these Botei Mikdashim had greater and greater chitzonius, external appearance of magnificence, and had a diminishing amount of ruchnius. So he says it's a very interesting principle in life generally. Of course, it's true that when you make a shul, for example, or a home, or a school, or Beis HaMedrash, whatever it is, if it's a small, dark, dirty building, that's not Kavod HaTorah. That's not mechubad. So you make something beautiful. You make it something which feels good and looks good, and that's great. That's all Hidur Mitzvah. We have a principle of Hidur Mitzvah. But he says, this is the principle of diminishing returns. That at a certain point, more is less. At a certain point, putting more magnificence, more beauty, and more gashmius into the experience of being in a building, at a certain point, it becomes so overwhelming that you can't think about the spiritual purpose of it at all because you're so blown away by its outward appearance. And it's same with people. A person can be good looking. And it's nice to be good looking. One should look mechubad and look masudar. But if a person spends too much attention on the good looks, then when he meets other people, all they think about is, wow, isn't he or she so fantastically beautiful or good looking or whatever it is, and they can't pay attention to the teichen. So there is a certain point of diminishing returns at which, says the Sforno, the external beauty only is at the expense of the inner teichen. And that is, I think, also a very fascinating concept. Whenever we are building whatever it is we're building, whether it's a home or a school or a shul or a Beis HaMedrash, we want to have a Hidur Mitzvah Kavod HaTorah, but we need to pay attention to this curve of diminishing returns, which the Sforno here talks about, and draws our attention to the fact that as the Beis HaMikdash got bigger and more beautiful, it became less and less in its teichen, in its spiritual teichen. That is the second point I want to say from the of Parshas Pekudai. The third point is also very, very interesting, just a detail. In the making of the Beis HaMikdash, it says at the end of Pekudai that one of the things they made were the Adonim. The Adonim were solid silver metal sockets which were used as the foundations of all the keroshim. Now there were 48 keroshim. Each keresh had 2 prongs coming out of the bottom of it, but the whole of the Mishkan, how is it going to be solid and stable? You can't just simply take a plank of wood and stick it in the sand or stick it in the earth and it'll stand there permanently. It needs to have, first you have to put in heavy, solid metal sockets, and those are the foundations. So the Adonim actually were the strength and stability of the entire Mishkan. What were they made of? They were made of kesef. Says the Pasuk, Ma'as kikar la'oden, that each oden was made, each one of these foundations was made of a kikar kesef. A kikar kesef, it turns out, is 3,000 shekel kesef. The weight of 3,000 shekel, right? So if you have 100, so where does the Adonim come from? So the cheshbon is, the Pasuk tells us that 603,550 men each gave a chatzi shekel. So if you work on the basis of 600,000 men, 600,000 men will give 300,000 shekel if each one gives a chatzi shekel, and 300,000 shekel if each kikar is 3,000 shekel, is exactly 100 adonim. So you had 100 foundations of the Mishkan, which all were made from the chatzi shekel that everybody gave. What happened to the extra 3,550 is a subject for a separate shir. It's also a very interesting topic, but not for now. Kol ponim, what we find here is the Torah goes out of its way to tell us that the adonim somehow were from the whole of Klal Yisrael, the chatzi shekel from everybody, Ha'osher lo yarbev, Ha'adal lo yamid, everybody can equally contribute to the adonim, and they were the foundations of the entire enterprise. Comes along the Balaturim, and he does what he always does, is he joins the dots in a unique and creative way. Says the Balaturim, when the Gemara says in Menachos, Daf Mem Vav, the Gemara says that Chayav Odom Levorech Mea Brachas B'Yom, and that's brought down in Shulchan Aruch, brought down in the Rambam Hilchos Tefillah, that there is an obligation, if one is possibly able to make 100 brachas every day. If you make a cheshbon on a weekday, it's not so difficult. You have Birkas HaShachar, and then you have Shachos Mincha and Ma'ariv, and by the time you get through the day and you've made your brachas for the day over food, etc., and benching and everything, it comes to 100 brachas, and there's a special mitzvah to have 100 brachas a day. On Shabbos, it's harder to do because the Shemona Esrei are much shorter, right? So in fact, there's a whole simon in Shulchan Aruch which says that, and this is the origin of what we call a kiddush, making a kiddush after davening in the morning, is in order to be able to make up the mea brachas for the day. Says the Balaturim, where do you get the idea of mea brachas? The mea brachas, he says, are mea adonim. The word, it's a play on words. That the word adonim, of course, is related to the word aleph dalad nun yud, which is the Shem Hashem. If we mention the Shem Hashem 100 times a day, these create the solid silver foundations of the life of every Jewish person. That our brachas, whenever we engage in the world, whether it's to do a mitzvah, or to benefit from the world, or to give shevach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whatever it is, by saying a bracha, those are the adonim of our life. And that is the merumas in a very beautiful way, from the me'as kika la'oden, and I wish everybody that Be'ez Hashem, we should be able to build these foundations with our brachas and be nene from the Shechina, which was Sheireh in the Mishkan, Vayakhel-Pekudai.